Masechet Sanhedrin, Daf Samech Aleph. We're talking about the death penalty for idolatry, and we want to identify what precise actions would make someone liable to the death penalty. So we have two Pesukim. One is in Shemot, Zobeach la'Elohim yachoram bilti ladonai levado. Someone who sacrifices to other gods will be destroyed, and that means the death penalty. And we learn from the continuation of that Pasuk that it's not only sacrifice, that says Zoveach here, but other forms of other actions that one would do to worship Hashem properly in the Bet HaMikdash. If one does them to idolatry, then that would be liable to the death penalty. So that would include sacrifice, incense, libation, which are all done in the Bet HaMikdash. You cannot do those. That would be death penalty. Now, what about other things? Like, how about just bowing? Bowing is not one of the official avodot that one needs to do in the Bet HaMikdash. You can do it, but it's not part of the official ceremonies, and therefore it wouldn't be included in this zoveach, because this zoveach means only things that are like sacrifice, that have to be done in Bet HaMikdash. So bowing is not an official part of serving Hashem, yet that also is prohibited by death penalty to do to idolatry because of a different pasuk in Devarim, Vayishtachu lahem. So that's what we saw so far. Two Pesukim, one for these official things. And again, it doesn't matter if this particular idol is not generally sacrificed to. It doesn't matter if one sacrifice or incense. If one gives incense to any idol, even though it's not the usual way of serving it, nevertheless, one gets the death penalty. Okay, so that's what we saw so far. And then we asked about, what about like hugging, kissing, cleaning, doing other things that give honor to the idol, but they weren't done in the Bet HaMikdash. They're kind of like bowing. And we said, no, those are not included in the death penalty. That they're not punishable by death because they're not included in this pasuk over here. This says only things that are like sacrifice, and kissing and cleaning are not things that are done in the Bet HaMikdash. And the only exception is bowing. That's what this pasuk comes to say. One exception, and that's it. Bowing is the only exception, and not hugging and cleaning and so on. That's where we left it. And now we're going to have a question on this. And the question is, why did you choose this pasuk to give you the absolute definition, and this is the only one exception? Why don't you say the other way around? Why not say this pasuk is giving the general definition that anything like bowing, anything that gives honor to the idol, should be prohibited by the death penalty, right? And then, and that would include everything. It would include bowing and hugging and cleaning and sacrifice. It would include everything. In fact, anything that you do that's in an honorable way. If it's a dishonorable way, by the way, well, we saw it, and we're going to see further that if like throwing rocks at it or defecating, if that's the way that this particular idol is worshipped, then that would be a death penalty, otherwise not. So we can learn from here that anything that's honoring it would get the death penalty. Why don't we take this as the main pasuk and learn everything instead of taking this one as the main pasuk? So that's what we're going to ask, and then we're going to say, oh yeah, but if you do that, then what will you do with this pasuk Zoveach la'Elohim yachoram? Then this would be extra, and so that's what we're going to deal with. Well, it seems that this pasuk would be extra then. So here we go. Amar le Rava bar Rav Hanan le Abaye. Rava, the son of Rav Hanan, asked Abaye, remember this name because we're going to make reference to it again. So why don't we say that hishtachava, bowing down, comes to teach on regarding the general category, that anything that is not just bowing, anything like bowing, that is an honorable thing that you're doing to the idol, should be killed by the death penalty. So take this as the model. And then I know you'll ask, the other pasuk of Zobeach la'Elohim yachoram, what are you going to do with that pasuk? It's extra. So if it's extra, then it must be that no, this is the main pasuk, that we need this to limit, exclude hugging. That's what we need this pasuk, only things that are like sacrifice. And this pasuk, Vayishtachu lahem, is a one-off, only one exception. So this is what we're going to try to get to. We want this pasuk, Zoveach, to be in fact extra and not usable for anything else. If we find that it's not usable for anything else, then we'll be good. and because then we have to use this for the definition, and vayishtachu lahem we can use just for bowing. But if we find that zoveach can be used for another purpose, well then we can forget about that pasuk. It's already used up for something else, and then we can define the actions based on vayishtachu, and that would include hugging and cleaning to be under the death penalty. So that's where we're going. We want this pasuk to be extra. But we are going to find now a candidate that we can in fact use this pasuk for. Legufeh dem chashevin me'avoda la'avoda. Why don't we learn from here that we, for its own context, that we take into consideration intention when one is doing one part of an avodah to a different part of the avodah. Here's a background and an example. Take a regular korban in the Bet HaMikdash, a kosher korban, and the kohen does shechita. While he does shechita, he has in mind that he's going to do the sprinkling of the blood in a few days from now, not at the right time. If he does that, then he gets the death penalty, even though the slaughter itself he did properly. And he did everything okay. He did it for Hashem and all that. But because he had the wrong intention, not only the wrong intention about the shechita, he had the right intention about doing the shechita properly. But while he was doing shechita, he had said, "I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to do the sprinkling at the wrong time." That is called mechashevin me'avoda la'avoda. If one does that for a regular kosher sacrifice, that is pigul. That animal cannot be used. And so the question is, do we apply that law also for to avodah zarah? If someone takes an animal and does shechita, he says, "I'm doing the shechita, just regular shechita for no reason, but I have in mind that after shechita, I'm going to take the blood and I'm going to pour it for avodah zarah." What would happen in that case? Is that permitted or not permitted? There's two questions really. Can the animal be used, or is it now you can't get any benefit from it? And second, will the person who does that get a death penalty for idolatry, even though he didn't do idolatry yet? He didn't pour the blood yet, but he did shechita, having in mind that he will use the blood for it. Okay, so we're going to see both of those questions. And the first question of what to do with the animal is subject to a machloket, the itmar. Hashochet behema lizrok dama la'avodah zarah. Someone does shechita, and he has in mind that he's going to sprinkle the blood for avodah zarah. He didn't sprinkle it yet. He's just slaughtering it yet. So do we consider that slaughter also to be an act of idolatry, and that would make the animal itself prohibited? You can't use it. Or to burn its fat for avodah zarah. Rabbi Yochanan amar asura, v'Resh Lakish amar muteret. Rabbi Yochanan says it's a problem, and he actually learns it from pigul. Just like with a kosher sacrifice, if you do shechita having in mind to do the sprinkling at the wrong time, that makes the animal no good. So too, Rabbi Yochanan says, by analogy to avodah zarah, if you do shechita having in mind that you're going to use the blood for avodah zarah, then it's no good, and you can't use that animal at all. That's what Rabbi Yochanan says, and therefore, according to Rabbi Yochanan, in fact, this pasuk would be extra because he learns this law from somewhere else. Since this pasuk is extra, that's good. We want the pasuk to be extra. That way, we have to use it for the definition to exclude hugging. Resh Lakish amar muteret, but Resh Lakish says that this law regarding avodah zarah is permitted. If I do shechita, having in mind I'm going to give the blood to avodah zarah, but I didn't do it yet, it's permitted. There's no problem. So therefore, you see, there's a problem according to Resh Lakish, because then this pasuk is not extra, because this pasuk may be coming to teach this very prohibition. Since Resh Lakish is not learning it from pigul, then if we have this pasuk open, he would have to learn that it's prohibited. So that's what we ask. Hanichal Rabbi Yochanan, El Resh Lakish ba'ekera. It's okay for Rabbi Yochanan. He already said it was prohibited based on an analogy to pigul. So that then, according to Rabbi Yochanan, the pasuk is not needed for anything else, so it is needed only for the definition of what is prohibited to do to idolatry. What do you get a death penalty for? And since this pasuk is extra, it must mean that this is the main pasuk saying only sacrifice incense and libation and not hugging and kissing. And the only exception is bowing. So all this goes according to Shakish, according to Yochanan, but according to Shakish, I need this pasuk since it's open and extra. So then it would be used to say that the intention case is prohibited, in fact. And then, since this pasuk here is used for something else, all I have left is this pasuk of bowing, and that would include anything that is giving honor to the idol would be the death penalty. That's our question for within Resh Lakish. Matkif ladav papa u'Rabbi Yochanan la ba'ekera. Hold on, your assumption that it's okay for the Rabbi Yochanan, that assumption itself is wrong. In other words, this question is going to apply to the Rabbi Yochanan too, because ad kan lo כעשה רבי יוחנן אלא בהמה, אבל גברה לה ברכתה להו והתקרה לחיובי גברה לקטלה. What Rabbi Yochanan proved from Pigul is only that the animal itself is prohibited to get any benefit from it. However, the person that does the slaughtering for the sake of using the blood for avodah zarah, that Rabbi Yochanan never said that he deserves a death penalty, and therefore this pasuk we would need to teach us that someone who does that, it does require the death penalty. And if so, this is not extra to use for learning about hugging and cleaning. We would need this pasuk to teach me that someone who has intention during slaughter of a sacrifice to use the blood for avodah zarah, that he would get the death penalty, because Rabbi Yochanan did not learn that from anywhere else. And so, in fact, the question applies to Rabbi Yochanan as well. Okay, good. So now we made the question bigger. Let's see if we can have an answer. Matkif la Rav Yacha bered Rav Ika ul Resh Lakish mi ba'ekera. Hold on. Even according to Resh Lakish, do you really need a pasuk for this? Ad kan la kashareh Resh Lakish ela behema. When Resh Lakish said that it's permitted over here in this machloket, that he was only talking about the animal itself. I did shechita on an animal, and haven't had in mind, I'm going to take the blood and use that for avodah zarah. The animal itself, that's okay, because I didn't use the animal for avodah zarah yet. That's all that Shakish said. Aval gavra bar ketalahu midi dehava amishtachave lahar tehar mutar ve'obda b'saif. But regarding the person himself, I don't need a pasuk, not this, not any other pasuk, to tell me that the person that does it gets the death penalty, because it would be the same as someone who bows down to a mountain. If someone bows down to a mountain, are you going to tell me that the mountain is prohibited for use? No one else can climb up it, no one can build on it, no one can quarry from it? We don't say that. A mountain, because it's part of the ground, even if someone bows down to it, the person that bows down to the mountain, serves the mountain, that person, as a god, says, "You're my God," tells the mountain, that person will get the death penalty, and the mountain will be permitted. And therefore, Resh Lakish would apply the same thing here. If someone does shechita on an animal, having in mind that he's going to use the blood for avodah zarah, he certainly gets the death penalty. And I don't need this pasuk to teach me that, because, well, you can't get the blood without doing shechita. So this is part of an avodah of idolatry. Now, the animal itself happens to be that it will only become prohibited if you actually use part of the animal for avodah zarah, if you actually took the blood and sacrificed it. But because he didn't have in mind during the shechita that was for an avodah zarah act, so the animal could be permitted, but the person himself would be killed. And I don't need a pasuk, and therefore, in fact, this pasuk is extra according to the Resh Lakish, extra according to the Rabbi Yochanan, and we don't need it for the law of intention, and therefore we can use it for the definition of what acts are considered idolatry for the death penalty, and therefore, since this will be the main definition, only things that are like a sacrifice that are done to Hashem. Bowing is one exception to that, but hugging and kissing and cleaning an idol would not get the death penalty.
אמר לרב אחא מדפתי לרבינה, למאי דקאמר לרבה בר רב חנן לאביי,
Em hayaseh ishtachava lelamed ala kelal kulo, echa yavdu lemeute mai. Rav Acham Divrei es Ravina. According to the question that Rav Chana asked Abaye, that's the question that we started with. We answered the question, but let's go just back to the thesis of the question. And he said, why don't we assume that the pasuk about bowing, that's the main definition, and from there, that would mean that anything that is like bowing, any act that is honorable to an idol would be punishable by death. And we wouldn't need the other pasuk about Zaveach, use that for something else. According to that theory, there is yet another pasuk of Echa. That's this pasuk here. It says, be careful, don't be ensnared in following them after they are destroyed from before thee, these other nations. Lemor, Echa yavdu hagoyim ha'elet Eloheim be'seken gam ani. I know you're going to say, let me see how they worship their gods, and I'll do the same thing. So here it's specifically prohibiting something, worshiping idols in a way that they are usually worshipped by the idolaters. Now, what would this come to exclude? It's coming to exclude something because saying you only get the death penalty if you worship it in the way that they worship it. So there's some act that is an unusual way of worshiping where you wouldn't get the death penalty. Now, we already know from this pasuk, according to the questioner of Rav Acha, about Rav Hanan, and according to his thesis, the pasuk about bowing prohibits all actions that are honorable. So that means all those actions are included in the death penalty. So then what would be not included in the death penalty based on the word echa yavdu, because it's an unusual form. And so maybe you'll say, it's someone that defecates in front of, not peor, but rather a regular idol that usually you'd give a sacrifice to it, and now you do something negative, degrading to it, that would not be included in hishtachava'ah. So that then we already know it's already excluded based from hishtachava'ah because it's not honorable. So this would not be included anyway. So now, so this doesn't answer the question. We're still looking for something that we would exclude from capital punishment that, on the one hand, is included in hishtachava'ah because it's honorable, and is excluded because it's not the usual way. So this doesn't count. Oh, I know. Maybe it's someone who defecates in front of markulis. Markulis, usually the way to worship it is to throw stones at it, which is a degrading way of treating it. I might think that since the way of worshiping it is a degrading way, throwing stones, then I might think that any way of degrading it, including defecating in front of it, would be liable to the death penalty, and because that's a general way. And that's why I need echa yavdu. No, since markolis is not worshipped in that way of defecating, therefore it's not included in the death penalty, and that's what this pasuk is coming to teach me. Okay, good. Follow-up question. Elahad amar bi Eliezer. Meinayin lazobech behemad lamarkolis shu chayav, shenemar velo yizbechu od et zibchehem lase'irim. Imeno inyan lakedarka, tichtiv echa yabdu tenehu inyan l'shelo kedarka. Shelo kedarka mishtachava nafka. We have now a question from what Rabbi Eliezer said, because he asked, how do you know that, let's say someone makes a sacrifice to Markolis, how do you know that he would be liable to death penalty? That's not the usual way that they would worship Markolis. Usually they throw stones at it. And now he's not doing that. He's giving a sacrifice to it. So how do you know that that's not allowed? Well, because there's another pasuk that says, do not make sacrifices to these se'irim, these goat demons. Now, if it's not, this pasuk cannot be prohibiting something that is the usual way of worshiping them, and that would be the usual way of worshiping them, that people used to, these desert nomads, they used to make sacrifices to the goat demons. And that, we don't need a pasuk for that, as it says, Echa ya'avdu, go see how they worship their gods, and don't do the same thing. So we know that that's already not allowed. So since it doesn't fit, since this is not necessary to tell me about giving a sacrifice to Seirim or any other idol, that's the way to worship. It must be that's telling me that it's prohibited to do this even for an idol that is not the usual way to give it sacrifices, like Markulis, where that's the unusual way. Usually you throw stones at it. And so we learn from this pasuk here in Vayikra Basi'irim that you get the death penalty for giving a sacrifice to Markulis. But this whole thing is a question because Shelo Kedarka, we already know that something that is honorable is prohibited from Mishtachava'ah, according to the principle that we saw before. That do not bow down to them means anytime you do an honorable thing to an idol, you get the death penalty, even if it's not the usual way of worshiping that idol. So why do I need this whole derasha when I can simply learn it from this derasha that we have already? And the answer is Hatam bezobeach lehachis. No, here the Rabbi Eliezer is talking about is a person who is giving this sacrifice to Avodah Zarah, not actually because he wants to worship the Avodah Zarah, but rather because he wants to anger Hashem. He wants to show him his rebellion against the Torah, and says, look, I'm going to go do this and give this idol, and worship, give a sacrifice to this idol. If he was actually worshiping the idol because he really believed in it, then that would be prohibited from Mishtachava'ah, indeed, as we said. But if he's doing it not to worship the idol, so then it's not technically idol worship because his main purpose is different. His main purpose is to anger God. In that case, he still gets a death penalty, but based on a different pasuk, and that's where the Rabbi Eliezer what comes in. That's what he was coming to teach. Rav Hamnuna irkasu le Toreh. One time Rav Hamnuna lost his oxen, so he was going around searching for them. That has nothing to do with the story. The point is that while he was searching for them, happened to be Rabbah saw him, and he says, "Oh, Rav Hamnuna, I'm so glad you're here. I have a question that's bothering me. There are two Mishnayot that seem to contradict each other. Tenan, Ha'oved Avodah Zarah, Obed in Omer lo." Our Mishnah says that someone who worships Avodah Zarah gets the death penalty. That means he actually has to do an action and worship it. But if he just says, I'm going to worship Avodah Zarah, then he does not get a punishment. But we have another Mishnah that says the opposite. V'hanan tenan, ha'omer e'abod, elech ve'abod, ne'elech ve'na'abod. If someone says, I will worship, or I am going to worship, or let's go and worship, then they get the death penalty. So which one is it? Is it only if you do an action, or even if you say that I'm going to do it? There is a contradiction. Amar le be'omer eni mekabelo alai ela ba'avodah. And so Ramana says the first Mishnah that says someone who worships Avodah Zarah, that's not talking just about someone who worships. Of course, if someone worships, they get a death penalty. This case is talking about someone who says, I am not accepting this idol as a god upon myself until I actually do the worship. And therefore, when he's just saying that, he didn't yet accept it as a god. So therefore, he doesn't get the death penalty at that point, just for saying that until he actually does the action. Whereas when someone says, I am going to worship this god, that means he's already considering it as a god, even though he didn't actually do the worship yet. Since he's already calling it a god, therefore he deserves death penalty right away, just for that. That's different when he says, I don't accept it as a god until I do an action. Well, then he's not liable until he does an action. Rav Yosef Amar, Tana'eh shakalt me'alma. Rav Yosef didn't like this answer. He said, you're trying to reconcile these two Mishnayot. But in fact, we know that there is a machloket between two Tanaim about this very subject. Have you taken the Tanaim out of the world? Right? You're just ignoring all the Tanaitic traditions that we have. Tana'ehi tetanya ha'omer bo'u ve'ibduni Rabbi Meir mechayev Rabbi Yehuda poter. Braita says, if someone comes and says, I am God, everybody come and worship me. So he's an insider, and he happens to be that he's claiming everybody should come and worship him himself. So what about that guy? People didn't come and worship him yet. He just gets up in the middle of the subway and says, everybody worship me. Rabbi Meir says he is liable just for saying that. Rabbi Yehuda says no. He just said worship me, but no one did anything. He's not liable. Now let's explain. If people actually listened to this person and started bowing down to him and giving him gifts or whatever, then everybody agrees that that person would be liable to the death penalty, because the pasuk says in this week's parasha, do not make yourself an idol. idol. Literally means don't make an idol for yourself. But the rabbis make a derasha, don't stand yourself up, don't put yourself up as a god, like an idol that people should worship. So for sure, if people take an action, then the claimer to be God would be killed. But what if he's just talking and everybody's on the subway ignoring him, nobody's doing anything? Rabbi Meir says speaking is significant and he'd be killed just for saying, I am God, worship me. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, just speaking is nothing. If no one actually worshipped him, then he didn't do anything and therefore he is not killed. So you see, we can apply this machloka between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda to these two Mishnayot and say these two Mishnayot are authored by different people. The one that says that you actually have to do something with avodah zarah in order to be killed, that would be Rabbi Yehuda, who says words are nothing, you have to do something. And Rabbi Meir would be the author of this one that says if someone says, I am going to do avodah zarah, words are themselves significant, we kill him already for that. Just like the guy on the subway says, I'm God, everybody worship me, we kill him on the spot just for saying that, even though there's nobody else in the subway car. Hadad Amar Rav Yosef, Lav Miltahid Amari. But then Rav Yosef thought about this more and said, no, I take that back. In fact, even according to the Yehuda, if someone said, I'm going to do idolatry, we would kill him. That words are significant. Ditnan. Because the Mishnah says, Yehuda says that someone is not liable unless they say, I will worship, I'm going to worship, let us go and worship. So then why is there a machloket here regarding the guy who claims himself to be God? We're talking about a case where someone says, I am God, everybody worship me. And then someone says, yes, I will worship you. What about that? But he didn't actually do the action yet. Mor sabar mesit lasmo sham'ile ve'in dekamrile kushtahu. Rabbi Meir thinks that if someone claims to be God and people listen to him and they say yes, then they're saying that sincerely. That means this guy really convinced someone that he is God, and the listener said yes. Well, then once he said yes and accepted the claimer as a God, then the person who makes the claim deserves a death penalty, even though the listener didn't do anything yet. That's Rabbi Meir. And so since they didn't And Rabbi Yehuda, interestingly, says that when someone claims to be God, nobody listens to him because everybody says, what's the difference between him and the rest of us? He's a human being, we're human beings. Nobody believes him. And when they say yes, they mean it sarcastically. Yes, sure, you're God. Okay, fine. Whatever you say, just go on to the next car and leave us alone. We're trying to read over here. And so since they didn't mean it, therefore, it actually helps the claimer that the claimer is off the hook. That's what they're talking about, whether someone, when they say yes to some crazy guy claiming to be God, do they mean it or not? Well, if they mean it, then you'll kill the guy. If they don't mean it, you don't kill the guy. But that has nothing to do with whether a statement of I will go and worship is significant or not. They both agree that it is in fact significant, and therefore, we're back to the contradiction here. You can't say it's just two different Tanaim. It really is a contradiction between these two Mishnayot, and therefore you have to say the answer that we said before, that Rav Hamuna said, that the first one is talking about a case where he says, I'm not accepting the God until I go and worship it. So he didn't say anything because he accepted it as a God yet, whereas when he says, I will worship, he already accepts it at that point as a God and is liable already from that point. Now that was Rav Hamnuna's way of solving the contradiction, but now the Gemara is going to bring another way of solving the contradiction between the two Mishnayot. Umatnitin kan biyachid hanisat, kan berabim hanisatim. Yachid la mimlach v'ta'eh batre, rabim imleche v'la ta'u batre. When the Mishnah says that one is liable just for saying, I will go and worship, that's talking about an individual who says that. Whereas the Mishnah that says you actually have to do it in order to be liable, and speaking thinking is therefore is not enough. That's talking about a whole group of people that all say we're going to go and worship. They are not liable. What's the difference? Because if an individual says I'm going to go and worship idolatry, he's not going to change his mind. He will go astray and follow avodah zarah. So once he commits himself, that's it. He's just going to do it because he has his own mind. He's an individual. He decided I'm going to do avodah zarah. We assume he means it. He's going to do it, and therefore he's killed just for saying that. Whereas when you have a whole group of people, let's say they're listening to some speaker and they're all like, "Oh yeah, we're going to do it." But nobody's thinking for themselves. So when they're all together, so they all say, yeah, we're going to do it. But then an hour later when they dispersed, they said, oh, what did we say? Oh, we forgot. They changed their minds. Oh, that was a dumb thing. Why were we listening to him? So they're just in the moment when everybody else is saying, yeah, we're going to go worship avodah zarah. They go and do it. But then they say, no, forget, we're not doing that a few minutes later. And they're not actually going to go astray after idolatry. So therefore, they never meant it when they said we're going to do idolatry, right? We could tell then that it's a crowd commitment, which is not a commitment at all. Interesting distinction. Amar Rav Yosef, Mina Amin Allah. Rav Yosef says, how do I know that an individual is liable when he says, I am going to worship idolatry? Dichtib lo tobe lo velo tishma elav ha'aba v'shama chayav. As it says regarding someone who incites others to avodah zarah, do not approve of him, don't listen to him. That means that you make sure not to listen to him, because if an individual does listen to him, then he's going to follow him and he's going to be liable, right? Once he becomes convinced, then he's going to go and do it and actually do avodah zarah. So we see from here that an inciter to avodah zarah, if he convinces an individual, the individual will go through with it. That's true for an individual, but for a big group, generally it's just a temporary mass hysteria, but then a few minutes later, they are not going to commit to actually doing what they said. However, Abaye rejects this statement by Rav Yosef and the answer up here that comes along with it. He says, Mi shane ben nisat l'rabim l'nisat yachid. Is there really a difference between someone who incites a public and someone who incites an individual? That's what we said over here, that someone incites an individual, then an individual says, yeah, I'm going to do it. Then the inciter is killed because the individual is likely to follow it and not change his mind, whereas the public will probably forget about it and change their mind. But is there really a difference? In fact, there isn't, because in the Torah it talks about two laws of inciters, one about an individual and ir hanidachat, which is someone who comes and incites an entire city. V'ha'tanya ki yisitecha achicha ben imecha echad yachid hanisat ve'echad rabim hanisatim v'ha'katub yachid mikelal rabim v'rabim mikelal yachid. The Pesukim talk about someone who incites an individual, your brother, the son of your mother, and it goes on, and it doesn't matter whether one incites an individual or a whole public. They both are prohibited and both get the death penalty. So why does the Pasuk treat them separately? Because it wants to teach you something that's different about inciting an individual from a public and a public from an individual. What are the differences? It's only these. Yachid mikelal rabim, lachmir al gufo, lakel al mamono. If someone incites an individual, that's different from a public, because an individual who incites will get the death penalty of stoning, although his money will not be destroyed. So we are machmir on the individual and idolater as he's stoned, but the money is okay. Whereas when you have a whole ir hanidachat, then we are less severe on their bodies. They only get killed by the sword, not stoning. It's not as bad as an individual idolater, but their money is all destroyed in the city square. So we see that there is some difference between inciting an individual and the public. However, only regarding this is there a difference. And everything else, they are the same. And that would mean that there is no difference between someone who incites an individual or a whole public if they say we're going to do avodah zarah, then it's going to be the same law either way, and you cannot make this distinction. Ela amar Abaye, kan benisat mepi atzmo, kan benisat mepi acherim. Abaye therefore gives a different explanation for the contradiction between the Mishnayot. The Mishnah that says that someone is liable for actually worshiping, the earlier Mishnah, that's when someone decides on his own. He looks into it and he says, I think I'm going to do some idol worship. He is not killed unless he actually does it. Whereas someone who is incited by someone else, a friend comes and convinces him, hey, you should really do this, it's really good, and he says, okay, fine, then he's killed immediately. Why? If someone decides on their own, he's of his own mind. He thought about it, he said, I think avodah zarah is a good idea. But he's equally likely to, after an hour, change his mind and says, you know what? I really shouldn't, because he's making up his own mind. Whereas when someone's being convinced by someone else, once he says yes, that's it. The friend is not going to let him go. He's going to be persistent and not let him change his mind. And therefore, if he's so easily swayed, he's not going to be able to sway himself back. Not likely. And therefore, that's the second Mishnah, that he is killed immediately when he says, I will go do avodah zarah. Because he didn't make up his own mind, he's just going to follow someone else no matter what. Amar Abaye, mina amina la. He says, Abaye says, how do I know this distinction is true? Tichtib lo tobe lo velo tishma elav, ha'aba velo shama, ha'aba veshama chayav. The pasuk says, do not approve of someone who's telling you to do avodah zarah, and don't listen to him. What does this mean? That once you approve and listen to him, that's it. You're already liable because you're going to follow him. This is talking about following someone else. But if you thought about it on your own, then you very well may change your mind. Rava Amar, Idi v'idi benisat mepi acherim. Rava says, no, I disagree. Both Mishnayot are talking about where someone else convinces you. Ha de amar le kach ochelet, kach shota, kach metiba, kach meri'ah. Ha de lo amar le kach ochelet, kach shota, v'chule. In fact, the second Mishnah that says you're liable just for saying, I will go and worship it, that's when the inciter gives a lot of details and says, this is how the idol eats, this is how the idol drinks. These are the good things that this idol does for its worshippers. It gives them fertility, and it gives them fruit, and so on. And the punishments that it does for those who don't worship it, it gives them disease, and so on. He gives a lot of detail about it. And after the person listens to all the details, he says, I will worship it. He's not going to change his mind, because right now he's bought in or scared or wants the promises of all of these details. However, if the inciter did not give details, he just said, there's a avodah zarah thing, having a festival, come and join, but he didn't give details, and he said, okay, I'll join, then he's likely to change his mind, because he doesn't even know the details. He just said, yeah, but he may very well change his mind and not actually go. So that person, if he didn't know the details, is only killed if he actually goes and worships it. Amar Rava, mina amina la. Rava says, how do I know that this distinction is true? The pasuk in Devarim says, let us go, if people say, let us go and worship other gods, from the gods of the people that surround you, the ones near to you, or the ones far from you. Why does the Torah have to make a distinction between the near ones and the far ones? What's the difference where this pagan temple is, if it's near or far, right? Isn't it equally prohibited? Rather, the Rasha explains that from the nature of the close ones, you can figure out the nature of the faraway ones. If someone tells you about a close idol, this has power, you can see what it does miracles, okay, go there, you check it out, and you say, it doesn't do anything. So from the ones that are close by that you can check out, then you should learn the nature of the faraway one. Someone says, I came from a faraway land, and I saw this idol, it does miracles, it does crazy things, unbelievable. You just say, the ones around here don't really do anything, so therefore I can figure out that the ones out there, there's just a rumor, and they don't really do anything at all. My love, so that means that the inciter is coming to tell you, you should see what it does, right? He's talking about the faraway one. He says, it does these miracles, it does these punishments, it does these good things. So you see that the inciter is giving details about the idol, and you should be able to figure out whether it's close or far. And he tells you those details. Since you can check out the details when it's close, you should assume that the details when it's far are equally false. And so we learn from here that the insider does in fact say all the details, and that's why, in that case, the insider would be liable, even if the follower just says, yes, I will do it, then already the insider is killed, because it's likely that the person will in fact do it. Whereas if you didn't give details, then they don't really know what they're getting into, so they'll probably just drop the case and change their mind anyway. Rav Asher Amar Sefa B'Yisrael Mishumad. Rav Asher says a different story, a different answer. The first Mishnah is talking about a regular believing Jew. If he says, I'm going to do Avodah Zarah, he probably is going to change his mind. He's a good person. I don't know, he got into this idea into his head, but he's not going to go through with it, and so we don't kill him until he actually goes through with it. Whereas if a Jew is an apostate, he already went to the other side, he already went off the derech and rejected the Torah, and he says, I'm going to go do Avodah Zarah, what's going to stop him? He's likely to do it, and therefore he deserves the death penalty just for saying, I will do it. And finally, the last answer, which seems actually to be the peshat all along, Ravina Amar lo zo af zo katane. The Mishnah is in a structure of not only this, but even that. Very often the Mishnah says something more obvious, and then says something less obvious. So first the Mishnah says, if you do Avodah Zarah, you get the death penalty. I needed to know that. Well, you don't know all the death penalties for everything. So the Mishnah has to say what the death penalty is. And that the fact that you get that death penalty. And then a later Mishnah comes and says, oh, not only for serving it, but even for saying I will serve it, that also is a death penalty. There's no contradiction here. It's just adding one law onto another. Itemar ha'oved avodah zarah me'ahava u'mir'ah. Abaye amar chayav, Rava amar patur. An interesting machloket. Someone who does worship idolatry, but he does so not because he believes that this idol is actually a god, but he does it out of love or fear. Rashi explains this means love or fear of another person. Let's say fear of another person. He's afraid of this person. The person says, go do this avodah zarah, and the person's afraid. Or he loves him and he wants to impress him. So he's doing it for an external reason. He doesn't really believe that this thing is a god, but he's doing it to show love or fear of another person who is expecting him to do this. Is he liable? He's doing the act, but he doesn't really believe it. Abaye says, yes, he is liable. Rava says, no, he is not liable. Abaye amar chayav deha pelacha. Abaye says he's liable because he worshipped it. What does it matter if what he had in his head, he did it. So that means that's prohibited. Rava amar patur ikabele alebe loain ilala. Rava says, no. What did he do? He just bowed down to it or did some act? If he accepted it as a god, then yes, that's idolatry. But if he didn't accept it as a god, then it's an empty gesture, and therefore he would not get the capital punishment. Now we're going to bring 3 proofs for Abaye. Siman Ayved Yishtachave LeMashiach. That's the mnemonic for each of the 3. Amar Abaye, Mina Amina La. How do I know that one is liable, even if one is doing idolatry for an external reason? Ditnan Haoved Avodah Zarah Echad Haoved Vechule. Our Mishnah that we had above says someone who worships idolatry, whether one worships it or, and then it goes and lists a bunch of things like slaughters it, burns incense. The first thing, someone who worships it. Well, what is that coming to add, right? I mean, we just said that. We list a whole bunch of ways of worshiping it. So what does echad ha'oved come to include? Is this word not coming to include someone who worships out of love or fear is also liable? That's this extra word. No, Rava says, we already answered that up above, whereas Yirmiyah said that this is referring to someone who worships it according to the normal way it's worshipped. Even if it's an unusual act, if that's the normal way it's worshipped, then one is liable to capital punishment. And then it goes on, in addition to giving it incense or libations, even if that's not the usual way. Amar Abaye, Mina Aminallah. Abaye says, I have a second proof. De Tanya, Lo tishtachave lahem. Lahem iyata mishtachave, aval ata mishtachave le'adam kemotcha. Pasuk says, do not bow down to them, to idols. You cannot bow down to idols or other gods, but you can bow down to a person who is like you. If you're doing karate and that's custom, you bow down to the person in front of you, or for whatever, some ceremony, you bow to a person. That's okay. You bow after you give a piano concert, and then you bow. It's okay. You can bow to the audience. Yeah, but what if you're bowing to someone who is worshipped, like Haman was worshipped? worshipped. He claimed to be a god, and some people thought he was like a god. What about, can you bow to a person like that? Talmud Amar, lot velo ta'obdehem. That's why the pasuk says, do not serve them. Now Haman, did anyone really think he was a god? People were just afraid of him. That's why they bowed down to him. They weren't really worshiping him, and yet that is prohibited. So we see that even worshiping an idol or a god or something that you don't believe is a god, but only out of fear, is still prohibited. Because that's what it says here, right? Even if a person, regular person you could bow down to, but if the person claims like to be a god, then you cannot, even if you don't believe it, still you're not allowed to do it. Rava kehaman velo kehaman. And Rava says, no. When this Braita is mentioning the example of Haman, it's not saying 100% exactly like Haman. Like Haman in one way, but not like Haman in another way. Kehaman di'u gufei avodah zarah. It is like Haman in that he claimed to be God, and some people did think he was God. So yes, that kind of person is going to be a problem. But not 100% like Haman. In fact, Haman, people only worshipped him out of fear. Even though he claimed to be God, they didn't buy that. They worshipped him out of fear, and therefore bowing to Haman would be okay. The problem in the Braita is talking about someone who a person that is bad, that people are bowing down to because they really believe it. If they really believe he's a god, then it's prohibited to bow to him. But if you don't believe it, and you're just doing it out of fear, that's okay. And so this proves Rava's point that if bowing down to an idol for external reasons is not liable to the death penalty. And the third proof, Amar Abaye, Mina amin Allah, Detanya, Kohen Mashiach ba'avodah zarah, Rabbi Omer bishkagat ma'aseh, Hachamim omrim beha'alem davar. What happens if a Kohen Gadol, a Kohen who is anointed, if he worships avodah zarah by mistake? So he has to bring a korban. Usually when a Kohen Gadol does a sin by mistake, he doesn't bring a sa'ir like most people do, but rather a par. That's usually. Over here we're going to see that he actually brings a sa'ir if it's for avodah zarah. So he brings the same animal as everybody else. The question here is, what kind of mistake are we talking about? Rabbi says a mistake in the action. He knows idolatry is not allowed, but he did an action and didn't realize that this action fell into the category. He thought he was bowing to one thing, really he was bowing to something else, as the Gemara will explain. Hachamim say, no, we're talking about a mistake of the law. He thought that avodah zarah, or this particular action, was permitted. He knew exactly what he was doing and what he was bowing down to or worshiping, but he thought that this action is permitted. Okay, so that's the machloket. What kind of mistake? However, they agree. They agree that although Kohen Mashiach usually brings a par for a chatat, in this case for avodah zarah he brings a sa'ir like an individual regular lay person does. And they also agree that he doesn't bring an asham talui. Usually if a lay person does something, he's not sure if he did it or not. Then he brings an asham talui that will as a provisional guilt offering in the meantime to hold off any guilt until such time as he figures out whether he actually sinned or not. Kohen Gadol does not bring such the asham talui. Okay, so here's going to be the proof now. Hi, shigat maaseh avodah zarah hechidame. What's a case where he doesn't know the act that he did? He was mistaken about his act regarding idolatry. If he was in front of a pagan temple and he bowed to it, but he thought it was a Bet Knesset, he was bowing to a Bet Knesset, he was bowing before Hashem. He was the wrong. He knew that you're not allowed to bow to a pagan temple, but he thought this was not a pagan temple. He thought it was a Bet Knesset. In that case, his heart was sincere, so he doesn't have to have any punishment. He doesn't have to bring a korban at all. Ela dechaza andarta. Or maybe he saw a statue of a person and he bowed to it, thinking, what was he thinking about this person? Maybe he wanted to honor the person. Well, it depends. If he thought that this statue is a god, and he bowed to it knowingly, then he's mezid. He has to be given capital punishment. But if he didn't accept it as a god, it's just an important person, Abraham Lincoln or something, And Abraham Lincoln I have a lot of respect for, and he gives a little bow before the idol, but he doesn't think that it's a god. He just thinks it's a person. So that's nothing. He didn't do anything. So Abaye says it must be that the case of doing an inadvertent act is a case where he knew it was an idol, but he didn't believe that it was a god, the Kohen Gadol, and he was worshipping it only because of love or fear of someone else, and he thought that was allowed. Now, even though technically it's a mistake in the law, but he's not calling it a mistake in the law because he knows that this is a god, he knows that Avodah Zarah is prohibited, but he thinks just a detail of the law, so he's calling not a mistake in the law, but in the mistake of the reality of the case. And therefore, we see that since this is the only thing that could fit into this category of a mistake in the case, it must be Avodah Zarah. It must be that he did worship and bow down to this thing that people considered a god, but he was doing it only out of love and fear, and he thought that that's permitted. He made a mistake about that, so he brings a korban, a chatat, because of that. But that shows that if he knew that it was prohibited and did it anyway, b'mezid, then that would be prohibited with capital punishment, because you only bring korban for doing something by mistake if when you did it on purpose, it would be capital punishment if it's prohibited. If it is avodah zarah, then you get a capital punishment on purpose and a korban by mistake. And if it's not avodah zarah, then you don't bring a korban at all, and you don't get capital punishment. So isn't this a good proof that worshiping an idol from fear or love is in fact prohibited by mistake? Korban, on purpose, you would get the death penalty. Rava amar lach lo beomer mutar. Rava says no. The case here is where the Kohen Gadol thinks that idolatry is entirely permitted. He just doesn't know about the whole law. So that's the case. Now we ask, Omer mutar hainu alem davad. Hold a second. If he thinks that's totally allowed, that's not a mistake in the event. That's a mistake in the whole matter, and that doesn't fit into the definition that we're trying to figure out, which is something that would be a mistake that we're looking for to be. He says she got maaseh, right? That would be alem davad, not she got maaseh. If he thinks that all of idolatry is allowed, so that can't be the case. Rather, so what's the difference between helem davad and the case? Beomer mutar legamre, be'alem davad bekiyum miksat ubitum miksat. When we say that it's a mistake in the item, b'shigat maaseh, that would apply according to Rava, where he thinks that all idolatry is allowed. So then that's it. The whole event is allowed. Whereas helem davad means a mistake in one part of it. He knows some of the laws of idolatry, but he forgot some of the laws of idolatry. Then that would be called helem davad. But shigat maaseh, in fact, according to Rava, could be when he forgets the entire thing, and that's why he brings a korban, but it has nothing to do with ahava and yirah, and therefore Rava says this is not a proof for you, Abaye. And so in the end, both Abaye and Rava can interpret all of these three sources according to their own opinions. Baruch Adonai le'olam, amen ve'amen.